Hey everyone, welcome to the Spook Scoop with Brooke, Ben, Andrew, and Liv, where we discuss everything horror related. This podcast will be discussing The Cabin in the Woods, which came out in 2013. Take it away.
All right, so first we're going to start with a brief synopsis of the film. It's about 5 teenagers who head off a weekend in a secluded cabin, which is in the woods, hence the title. And when they get there, they find out they're really isolated and a lot of weird stuff goes on. They end up finding an odd assortment of relics, and one of which is activated by Dana, one of the lead characters of the film, who reads a book and recites these lines in Latin, and that awakens a family of deadly zombies. And we come to find, as the audience, that they're all sacrifices who are meant to die at the hands of some horrible monster in order to satisfy these gods so the world can survive.
So obviously, I think it's evident that this whole movie is a big trope and a big commentary on the whole horror cinema itself.
Each character kind of is acting in their own role that is part of the heteronormative society that we live in. Like, Kurt is very masculine and athletic, and he has the beautiful girlfriend who is very flirtatious and friendly and showing her skin. And
Right.
We also have Dana, who's the conserved woman who's very to herself and proper and worries a lot, very anxious, and she's also painted the Virgin.
Mm-hmm.
We also have Marty, who's the nerdy stoner guy who is just kind of an idiot and has that kind of masculine obliviousness to him at the same time.
Right, and then we also have a representation of the audience in the film that comes at the hands of the people who are running the whole show, the people who are the agents of deciding how they're going to die. And I feel like that gets a really good representation of the audience because it adds a little dramatic irony, how like we know that these people are watching over these kids and murdering them without any repercussions back on them, but as we find out later in the movie, they're not as safe as they think they are. I think that's like a really good play on just how sadistic horror movies are and how we, as the spectator, we want to see these stereotypical horror tropes play out. Like, we want to see these people die, and that really gets emphasized with the characters inside the office. As they even go as far as to bet on how they're going to die and which monsters are going to come up and kill all these kids.
So there's also the trope of the final girl, which we see in Dana as this innocent virgin type character. And at the end of the movie, we find out that this character has to be the last one to die. It's the same kind of idea that there's this final girl in the movie, she's the last survivor, and it doesn't really matter if she's alive or dead at the end, they just need to keep the story and the plot going.
Right, and then in contrast to that, you have the first girl to die who's labeled as the, pardon my language, but the whore of the film, and then she's the one that's first to go.
And just that's also the rule. She has to be the first one to die
right.
in the film.
So the second theme that was pretty evident throughout this whole film is the idea of surveillance and the concept of surveillance of being watched. So I definitely think that this whole idea about people watching people, or that kind of whole view on things, is definitely prevalent throughout the whole film. Just how you see the workers are constantly watching through different various cameras that are set up around the killing grounds, and how one of the characters say within the movie in that they're not the only ones watching, and that the gods are also watching it. It plays on the whole concept of pleasure that they take out of watching them suffer and watching them die.
Right, just how sadistic the whole thing is. Even as mentioned earlier, like they go as far as to place bets, and then you have some characters within the office who are trying to preserve humanity by murdering these children. You have the few people who are represented by a woman and a black man as going against what all these people stand for and what they want to see. And even in the whole thing where they're betting on how each person is going to die, they are the two who seemingly want to go against that.
There are a few characters who are kind of trying to break the status quo of the office that is torturing these young kids. And one of those is the security man named Truman. And him being named Truman is an Easter egg for The Truman Show, which is a movie that is about a boy who has grown up in this reality show, but he is completely unaware of it and is being watched, and there's a whole bunch of surveillance. His entire world is made up of surveillance, and that's basically an Easter egg for Cabin in the Woods because we have these 5 teens in this fake reality.
Yeah, and just kind of go on that, when we see in the movie when Jules is taking off her top and they're about to presumably have sex,
Right.
There's a cut scene to where you see all men watching the footage of this happening, and they want her to take off her top, even to go as far as, excuse my language, but like,
Yeah.
let's see them boobies.
Yeah,
like,
for
let's
sure,
See,
yeah.
Like, let's see her breasts. Like, there's obviously a male gaze that's prevalent throughout this.
Right.
Yeah, and I think also, I remember watching this and just watching these guys kind of being disgusted, like them being like, show off the goods.
Mm-hmm.
And then afterwards they say, we have to keep the customers happy. So what is that saying about us as viewers as well, this consumption? Well, we also desire this exploitation of women as well, and we expect that from a horror film. But also, what is it saying about this male gaze as well, as you guys were talking about?
I also was going in with the trope idea of how, like, we see all of the different monsters in the cubicles and the cages. It's like, that's another trope of, like, playing of, like, the classic horror movie of that we see every single, like, stereotypical monster, the zombie, like, the dead bride, the
werewolf.
sea monster, the werewolf. I was thinking that goes into the tropes of the whole idea of, like, this is what we as consumers want to see as horror movies, and so they just like throw every single classic monster that we're used to seeing just into one film, but it's like a mangle because it's like, who really is the monster?
Exactly.
Who's really the predator?
Mm-hmm.
Well, and also in these like cubicles, we see when they zoom out, I think it's kind of almost like these Easter eggs as well. Like we see a clown, like an It. We see the twins from The Shining. We
Right.
see the monsters, the werewolf.
There's like the doll faces kind of alluding to the strangers, I think.
And then we see also that these monsters are wreaking havoc on these guards as well when they're going through the elevators and stuff, and we see that through the screen as if we are now the people watching this havoc unfold.
You're saying how there's kind of like that whole other layer of at first the people in the office building are watching these people get tormented on by these monsters that have been just like pulled up from the ground out of this cubicle, and now we're the people that are watching them on their own security cameras getting killed and tormented and tortured by their own monsters that they've been captured in their cubicles.
Right.
It's like that whole level of spectatorship.
Yeah. It's like the top level, which is like I feel like it's the basic monsters that we see on the camera. Just like how it's like, so the top level, I'll kind of put it as, the zombies that we see, and then the other level is that we see the workers watching them, kind of, so they are their own monsters by kind of allowing this to happen.
Yeah.
And then you have the other level of spectatorship, which is us, that kind of makes us our own monsters because we're kind of viewing this with pleasure, and we kind of enjoy watching this stuff happen, unfold, and that kind of, I feel like, creates our own, like, we're our own kind of monster in that way.
Well, that's the other thing. I feel like with this movie, it's not like a parody, it's like a real horror movie,
With just comedic elements.
With just comedic elements, but it's also a kind of a mockery of the consumer and the audience, because the horror genre can be so academic and intellectual, but then it's kind of like, but this is what the audience want, this is what the consumer wants, and it's all just ridiculousness and like watching people perform in their normative gender roles and exploiting female sexuality and showing all of these ridiculous monsters that have absolutely no meaning or real depth to them into like what they are into our society and who we are as like consumers and audiences. It's all just like playing off of like the mockery of like, wow, this is what we want as consumers, but it actually has no real depth or real meaning to it.
Right. And I think the same thing actually happens in the Scream series. We see this, and it plays off common tropes and addresses them just like this movie. Like, this is definitely this kind of like meta-critique of what we think of these tropes and how we use them. And these characters have a similar awareness of what's happening in the film, and that this is kind of a joke. Like, the two final characters, when they realize what they're in, they're like, wow, I can't believe we're on this. This is like sick. It's stupid, and it's a farce, really. It's just, and it's also, and because of this, also, when we go down to the bottom, it's a tribute to these other films, and I feel like Scream also tries to do that, has these tributes, and they mention the different things that you expect in a horror film, and how you die, and who has to die first, what has to happen, and how the ending is supposed to play out. And I think that this movie is doing the same thing in that satirical way that you were mentioning as Cabin in the Woods.
Right, right. And even with its value as a satirical horror, as what it's meant to be read as, there's still people, like I'm reading some reviews now that just kind of state it as, like if you remember at the beginning of the class when we were writing our first impressions on horror, he was saying that most people were saying that it was about the thrill and the excitement that comes from horror movies. And a lot of these reviews even are saying, entertaining movie, not very meaningful, and like there's not a lot of narrative to it, when really it's one of the smarter horror movies that I've seen in terms of
Very smart, yeah.
Yeah, in terms of it touching on all these tropes, and
Yeah.
even like you said with the Scream series, how that can even be misread as kind of like a silly, hyper dramatized horror, which this could be read as that without exploring and kind of knowing your horror history and the common tropes of horror. But upon learning all these tropes and knowing what the stereotypes of horror are and how each horror movie kind of has its different representation of these tropes, like it's just interesting to see.
Exactly. It's kind of interesting because it's like if you are aware of the horror genre and its history and its complexities, then you can watch this movie and enjoy it and understand the connections and the correlations and everything like that. But if you're not, you can go in and you can have your thrill-seeking screaming and everything, and everyone gets their own thing by it. But it's a play on, okay, like this is what the audience wants, but this is like what we actually mean. And
And that's what makes it like what it's categorized at, is that it's poking fun at all these types of characters.
So there's also another prevalent kind of theme that plays throughout the whole movie is just the idea of free will. Are they really choosing how they die or how they act, or is it the workers who are toying with them like puppets kind of thing? What they kind of say in the thing is that although they steer the teenagers in some direction, ultimately they're the ones who are choosing how to die, and that's what makes the sacrifice kind of real, and that's why it works so well. They even goes to say that like the system doesn't work if the choice of free will isn't in there. So it's the whole idea of making their own decisions. There's the gas guy who definitely very creepy, but it's a whole idea of they have to make the decision to ignore the warnings that he gives. I think it's Mordecai. Yeah, Mordecai.
Yeah,
That's what they
Mordecai.
call him. So they have to ignore the signs of warning Mordecai in order for them to actually move on and for the sacrifice to work. The whole point of the gas guy is for having the teenagers ignore them, because if they don't ignore them, then it doesn't work.
Right.
They have to ignore his warning of not going.
Right, and then we as the audience find out that he's a part of this whole plan. Even like he calls ahead from the agency, and he kind of gives them this whole doomsday spiel on like, oh, you will pay for your sins and
then he's
stuff
like right out
They're
of character.
doomed.
Yeah, they're doomed.
But back to the puppeteer thing, I feel like there's only really 2 instances where these kids are choosing their own free will. Like you said with Mordecai, he's warning them about the cabin in the woods, but then they go anyways. And then also they chose to go to the basement, and they were the ones who messed with those things and ended up choosing their own death. But I feel like other than that, they were definitely like puppeteers in this big scheme of things, with the hair dye and with what they were smoking and drinking. And whenever Kurt and his girlfriend went into the woods, and then all of a sudden from the ground the smoke came, and they were breathing it in, and it was supposed to make them feel like romantic and sexual, and they were supposed to get distracted. And it just felt like, while yes, there was that aspect of free will, it was definitely like they were puppeteers.
They
in
needed
this
a
whole
push.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting to also note that Marty, who smokes a lot of weed and drugs and all that, they mention that he isn't affected by these drugs. He is the only one that is kind of aware of what's going on as well. And he says that, and he's like, don't you think it's a bit weird what's happening? And I don't think there's anything really like good about this place. Let's leave. And he's the one who also finds the camera in the cabin, and he thinks that he's on a reality TV show, and he also ends up being one of the only survivors. And I think this is also because he wasn't affected by those other things, and he wasn't a puppet, he wasn't influenced, and so he had more awareness than the other characters.
Right, which also kind of plays into the stereotypical thing in horror where someone hears a noise in the basement and then they say, oh, let's go check that out, when
Which
the
like
audience...
what Kurt says, like, let's split up, right?
And then Marty kind of represents the audience where he's like, I don't think that's a good idea. Like when they're in the basement and they find all these relics that will summon some sort of monster, he hears this voice that says, read it, in which all the other characters take that as, oh, like there's a voice in my head, like something's telling me to read it. Whereas Marty kind of represents the logic behind, like,
the voice of reason.
Yeah,
behind
if you find some
everything.
creepy Latin quote on a book, maybe don't read it out loud and summon these monsters.
But because of the character that he is, they don't take him seriously, right? Because he's set up not to be taken seriously. So we as an audience also choose to ignore what he's saying, not just the people around him, but we also are like, oh, whatever, like it's just Marty being a goof or whatever, like, so we don't heed these warnings.
Yeah, I also had another point about how earlier when we were talking about how I was saying that Marty represented kind of the voice of the audience and the voice of logic, and how, if you guys remember at the end of the film, when Sigourney Weaver makes her cameo as the operator of this operation, I wrote in my notes here that the audience loses its voice when Sigourney Weaver persuades Marty into giving Dana the gun and then begins to persuade Dana into killing him. And that is the moment when the audience loses its voice in the film.
Well, I have a quote here too from Sigourney Weaver saying to Marty, die with them or die for them. So it's not even like we have a say. It's one or the other. You have to die. You can't survive.
And she's making a noble claim out of it too. She's stating that
exactly
for the sake of humanity.
So, this whole discussion just boils down to the idea of how important a movie like Cabin in the Woods is. I think how the movie itself encapsulated all these different tropes and made this huge commentary on horror cinema in general. I think this makes it in itself a classic of a film. Use of horror and use of comedy really makes this film unique and kind of stands out amongst a lot of horror films.
All right, guys, I think that's all the time we have. Thanks for listening to us today. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we're also on Apple Music and Spotify.
Buy our merch too.
Yeah, we have merch on our website, www.
Spook Scoop.
Yeah, the spookscoop.com. We'll see you guys later. Ciao for now.